Basic phrases. Phrases are grammatical building blocks, typically, but not always, multi-word constructions that act as a single part of speech unit. As you will see, this definition of phrase differs a little from the definition of a phrase in traditional grammar. In this chapter, we will examine 4 types of phrases: noun phrases, appositive phrases, verb phrases, and prepositional phrases. All phrases contain a head that determines the nature of the phrase. The head of a noun phrase is a noun. The head of an appositive phrase is an appositive. The head of a verb phrase is a verb. And the head of a prepositional phrase is, surprise, a preposition. Noun phrases. The term noun phrase is not widely used in traditional grammar. However, the distinction between a noun and a noun phrase is quite clearly made in traditional grammar, though in different terminology, simple subject and complete subject. A simple subject in traditional grammar corresponds to a head noun in modern grammar, and a complete subject corresponds to a noun phrase. Traditional grammar, modern grammar. Traditional grammar, simple subject equals modern grammar, head noun. Traditional grammar, complete subject equals modern grammar, noun phrase. In the examples that follow, the head, simple subject, is in italics and the noun phrase, complete subject, is underlined. The well-dressed young woman glanced in the mirror. The sleek new car in the driveway belongs to my grandmother. The chilly November rains never seem to let up. Appositive phrases. An appositive phrase is a phrase headed by an appositive. An appositive is a noun that follows another noun or pronoun to identify or explain it. Here's an example of a sentence containing an appositive in italics. She is going out with Richard, a guy in her exercise class. The appositive is used to give information that helps identify who Richard is. Appositive phrases are essentially special-purpose noun phrases. The appositive is the head noun, and the rest of the appositive phrase consists of modifiers of the noun, adjectives in front of the appositive noun, and modifying prepositional phrases following the appositive noun. Here are some examples with the appositive phrases in italics and the appositive heads in bold. Atolls, small coral island, covers shallow tropical waters. His car, a hulking SUV, cost a fortune to fill up and rides like a tank. The police went to his last address, an old hotel in Denver. Notice that all the appositive phrases are set off from the rest of their sentences by commas. A pair of commas in the appositive phrase is in the middle of the sentence, or a single comma in the appositive phrase is at the end of the sentence, as in the last example. If the appositive phrase follows the subject noun phrase, we can move the appositive phrase to the beginning of the sentence. Appositive phrases moved out of their normal position following the noun phrase are sometimes called inverted appositives. Following is an example of a sentence containing an appositive phrase in italics that can be inverted. Normal order. Emma, the only child in the class with no cavities, smiled proudly. Inverted order. The only child in the class with no cavities. Emma smiled proudly. There is one situation in which it is normal to invert the appositive phrase, when the subject noun phrase is a pronoun. Here are 2 examples, appositive phrases in italics. A hopeless romantic. I always want movies to have a happy ending. Always a sucker for a smile. He gave in to his daughter's request. If we were to leave the inverted appositive phrases in their normal position following the nouns they explain, the results might or might not be grammatical, but they would certainly be odd. I, a hopeless romantic, always want movies to have a happy ending. He, always a sucker for a smile, gave in to his daughter's request. The question mark at the beginning of a sentence indicates that the sentence is only marginally grammatical. Essential and non-essential appositive phrases. Up to this point, all the appositive phrases we have examined have been non-essential. Non-essential appositive phrases are not required to define the noun phrase they follow. That is, we can delete the appositive phrases and still be left with a meaningful noun phrase. For example, in the following sentence, Noel Coward wrote Private Lives, his best-known play in 1930. The appositive phrase, his best-known play, can be deleted without affecting the basic identity of the noun it follows. Noel Coward wrote Private Lives in 1930. Private Lives would still have been written by Noel Coward in 1930 even if we were not told that it is his best-known play. Even if the play were to be largely forgotten, it still would have been written by Noel Coward in 1930. Compare this example of a sentence containing a non-essential appositive with the following sentence, which contains an essential appositive. My friend Tim works in the city. Presumably, the writer of this sentence has more than one friend. So when we delete the appositive phrase Tim, we lose information critical to establishing the meaning of the noun phrase my friend. My friend works in the city. We have no idea which of the writer's friends works in the city. The distinctions between essential and non-essential appositive phrases is not so much a grammatical distinction as a judgment about what we can reasonably expect the reader to know. For example, compare the following sentences. Non-essential, Homer, the Greek poet, was blind. Essential, the Greek poet Homer was blind. In the first sentence, the appositive phrase, the Greek poet, is non-essential because we can reasonably assume that everyone who can read without moving their lips knows who Homer was. The reader does not need the information in the appositive phrase to identify Homer. In the second sentence, on the other hand, the appositive phrase Homer is essential because the reader would not have any way of knowing which Greek poet the sentence was about. The Greek poet was blind. A simple and reliable way to test whether an appositive phrase is essential or non-essential is to delete the appositive and see the effect on the noun phrase preceding the appositive phrase. If that noun phrase is still meaningful, then the appositive phrase is non-essential. If the meaning of that noun phrase is now inappropriately ambiguous, then the appositive phrase is essential. Essential and non-essential appositive phrases are always distinguishable by their punctuation. Essential appositive phrases are never set off with commas. Non-essential phrases are always set off with commas. Verb phrases. A verb phrase is a phrase headed by a verb. The distinction between a verb head and verb phrase is quite clearly made in traditional grammar, though in different terminology, simple predicate and complete predicate. A simple predicate in traditional grammar is a verb head and a complete predicate is a verb phrase. Traditional grammar, modern grammar. Traditional grammar, simple predicate equals modern grammar, verb head. Traditional grammar, complete predicate equals modern grammar, verb phrase. In the examples that follow, the verb head, simple predicate, is in italics and the verb phrase, complete predicate, is underlined. The well-dressed young woman glanced in the mirror. The sleek new car in the driveway belongs to my grandmother. The chilly November rains never seem to let up. Most verb phrases consist of a verb head together with the verb's complement. A verb complement is whatever is required by a particular verb to make a complete sentence. For example, here is a sentence with the verb in italics and the complement in bold. A truck driver saw the accident. If we delete the complement, we get either a totally ungrammatical sentence or a new, unrelated sentence that does not mean the same thing as the original. The truck driver saw. In other words, when we use the verb see with the meaning of to observe, we need to express what it was that the subject saw. As you recall from Chapter 1, the traditional definition of verb is a word used to express action or describe a state of being. As the definition implies, there are two different types of verbs, action verbs and linking verbs that describe the subjects. Here are the examples from Chapter 1. Action verbs, linking verbs. Action verbs, Donald laughed. Linking verbs, Donald is funny. Action verbs, Jane wrote a novel. Linking verbs, the novel became a bestseller. Action verbs, Irma made soup. Linking verbs, the soup smelled wonderful. The terms action and linking are not very transparent. Part of the problem is with the term action. Certainly, many action verbs express action. In the first example, Donald engaged in the action of laughing. In the second example, Jane engaged in the action of writing a novel. In the third example, Irma engaged in the action of making soup. So far, so good. However, many action verbs do not express action in any normal sense of the word. Here are some examples of the actionless action verbs. Fred has a new car. Pat forgot his keys. The garden swarmed with bees. A classic example from a 19th century grammarian. In the first example, Fred is not engaging in any overt action. The verb has seems to describe what Fred owns or possesses rather than tell us what Fred does. Compare that sentence with this sentence. Fred bought a new car. Here, Fred is clearly engaged in the action of buying. In the second example, the meaning of forgot is almost the opposite of any kind of action. Poor Pat didn't engage in the action of bringing his keys. In the third sentence, the garden is not engaged in the action of swarming. The bees are. The garden is not doing anything at all, yet this is still an action verb. The problem these examples illustrate is that there is no good way to define the class of action verbs by meaning alone. Because action verbs constitute such a large and diverse class, 99.9% of all verbs, it is impossible to find a single defining characteristic that will hold equally well for all action verbs. The only really accurate definition is a negative one. Action verbs are those verbs that are not linking verbs. Beginning with linking verbs works because this class of linking verbs is very small and has certain distinguishing characteristics, making it relatively easy to define. So we will begin with linking verbs and then turn to action verbs. Linking verbs and their complements. The term linking refers to the relation between the complement of the linking verb and the subject. In linking verb sentences, the verb links the complement back to the subject. In other words, the complement must give some information about or description of the subject. Here are the three examples of linking verb sentences again. Donald is funny. The novel became a bestseller. The soup smelled wonderful. In the first example, the predicate adjective, funny, describes Donald's personality. In the second example, the noun phrase, a bestseller, tells us something about the success of the novel. In the third example, the predicate adjective, wonderful, tells us something about the nature of the soup. Sometimes linking verbs are compared to equal signs. That is, we can replace the linking verbs with equal signs. Donald equals funny. The novel equals a bestseller. The soup equals wonderful. While the analogy of linking verbs to equal signs is not perfect, it does convey a sense of the special relationship between the complement and the subject in sentences with linking verbs. This relationship is completely absent in action verbs. The complements of linking verbs are collectively called subject complements. The term subject complement comes from the fact that the complements of linking verbs must refer back to and describe the subjects. Two common subject complements are adjectives, called predicate adjectives, and noun phrases, called predicate nominatives. Here are examples of sentences that illustrate each type of subject complement. Subject complements in italics. Predicate adjective. Olive oil sounded happy. Predicate nominative. Bluto is a bully. Linking verbs have a unique grammatical feature that distinguishes them from all action verbs. Only linking verbs can have predicate adjectives as complements. If a verb can be used with a predicate adjective complement, then we know for certain that the verb is a linking verb. This extremely useful fact gives us a simple way to distinguish linking verbs from action verbs. If a verb can take a predicate adjective as a complement, then it must be a linking verb. Linking verbs can also be followed by noun phrases, but even here, predicate nominatives, the type of noun phrase that follows a linking verb, are functionally different from the type of noun phrase that follows an action verb. Here is a pair of examples. Linking verb. Alice became a successful writer. Action verb. Alice met a successful writer. The same noun phrase, a successful writer, follows the verbs in the two examples. So how can the complements be different? The complements are completely different in their relationship to their subjects. In the linking verb example, the predicate nominative, a successful writer, and the subject, Alice, must be one and the same person. Alice equals a successful writer. In the action verb example, the object, a successful writer, and the subject, Alice, cannot be the same person. Alice does not equal a successful writer. By definition, predicate nominative have two distinctive characteristics. 1, they are always complements of linking verbs. 2, they must identify or rename the subject. For example, they must refer to the same person or thing as the subject. There are only a handful of verbs that can be used as linking verbs. By far, the most common is the verb be. Because the verb be is the most widely irregular verb in English, it might be helpful to review its various forms. Forms of be: present tense, first person singular, I am, first person plural, we are. Second person singular, you are, second person plural, you are. Third person singular, he, she, it is, third person plural, they are. Past tense. First person singular, I was, first person plural, we were. Second person singular, you were, second person plural, you were. Third person singular, he, she, it was, third person plural, they were. Future tense. All persons and numbers, singular, will be. Present participle, singular, being. Past participle, singular, been. Many common linking verbs are verbs of appearance or sense perception. For example, sight. They appeared angry about something. Larry looked pleased with himself. Sam I am seemed a little sad today. Sound. The tenor sounded flat to me. The note rang true. Smell. Some tropical fruit smells absolutely dreadful. Taste. The fruit cake tasted stale. The remaining common linking verbs describe the nature or condition of the subject. For example, the cook always gets upset when someone complains about the food. The kitten soon grew strong. The patient remained weak. Tarzan stayed angry about the incident with the coconuts. The explorer became faint with hunger. I feel terrific. His face turned bright red. Although all the verbs used in the preceding examples are linking verbs, some can also be used as action verbs. When they are used as action verbs, their meanings are completely different from when they are used as linking verbs. Here is an example using the verb feel. Linking verb. The detective felt sick. Action verb. The detective felt the victim's body for the missing gun. In the first example, the linking verb felt is used to describe the detective. In the second example, the action verb felt tells us what the detective did. He or she engaged in the action of searching the body. Notice also that the linking verb is followed by the predicate adjective sick, while the action verb is followed by an ordinary noun phrase object, the victim's body. The noun phrase, the victim's body, cannot be a predicate nominative because it does not refer back to the detective. Detective does not equal the victim's body. Grammar trivia. The permissive can. In formal communication, the helping verb can is, among other functions, used to indicate the ability to do something. I can visit on Wednesday. The most formal choice when granting or asking for permission calls for using may. You may open your exam booklets now. In informal settings, we frequently use can for permission. When casually asking permission from a friend, no one should mind if you use can. Can I park in your driveway? In fact, may would seem stuffy and overly formal, or even give the impression that you are an English teacher.